London, early 1940. In a requisitioned, stately home on the northern edge of the city called Trent Park, engineers from RCA have wired the walls, the light fittings, and even the trees outside with concealed microphones, because the British Army has discovered something almost by accident, that captured German officers, left alone in comfortable rooms, with good food and no visible interrogator in sight, will talk to each other with a freedom they would never show across an interrogation table. The operation has a deliberately dull name, the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center, and the people doing the actual listening, hour after hour, headphones clamped on, transcribing every word in shorthand German, are overwhelmingly refugees. Young men and women who fled Germany and Austria in the 1930s, and who now sit in windowless rooms translating the private conversations of the men who drove them out. One of them, a German-born Jewish refugee named Fritz Lustig, later described how a prisoner's reaction to a deliberately clumsy, almost useless interrogation session was often more revealing than the session itself, because the prisoner would go back to his cell and tell his cellmate exactly what he'd been asked, what he'd managed to hide, and how much he thought the British actually knew, never suspecting that the walls were listening to that conversation too. It is one of the stranger inversions of the war. Some of the most effective intelligence work done against Nazi Germany was done by German Jews in German, using the enemy's own instinct to underestimate the person sitting across from them. That instinct, the assumption that a Jewish refugee or a Jewish woman could not possibly be a serious threat, became, deliberately, a weapon. In March 1942, a British officer named Captain Herbert Buck, who had escaped Afrika Korps captivity in the Western Desert by walking back to Allied lines disguised in scavenged German uniform pieces, proposed something unusual to Middle East Command: recruit German-speaking Jewish volunteers from Mandatory Palestine, dress them as German soldiers, and send them behind Axis lines. The unit was called the Special Interrogation Group. Its members were mostly Jewish refugees who had fled Europe and settled in Palestine. Men who spoke the language and understood the culture of the army now occupying their former homelands well enough to walk through German checkpoints wearing German uniforms and answer German questions in accent-perfect German. It was, by any measure, one of the strangest and most dangerous roles any Jewish service person held in the entire war, because capture meant certain execution as a spy, not the comparative protections of the Geneva Convention. The women's story runs alongside this, through a different door. The British Auxiliary Territorial Service began recruiting locally in Mandatory Palestine in January 1942, starting with a small group of 60 women trained as officers and non-commissioned officers, with WAAF recruitment following in May 1943. By the time recruitment wound down, roughly 4,350 women from Mandatory Palestine had volunteered for British Forces service, the large majority of them Jewish, according to the Jewish Women's Archives account of ATS and WAAF service in the war. At its peak in March 1943, over 5,000 ATS women were serving across the Middle East, and the British Army's own post-war history of the service records that roughly 80% of them were not British nationals at all, but locally recruited women, drawn overwhelmingly from a Jewish community in Palestine that had, in many cases, arrived as refugees from the very country whose army they were now helping process, translate, and track. One of them, Esther Hurlitz, later became an Israeli diplomat and member of the Knesset, and wrote her own account of what it meant to serve as what the British simply filed as Palestinian personnel, a category that, as she put it, folded together Jewish and Arab volunteers under one administrative label, regardless of who they actually were or why they'd enlisted. What these women actually did inside the ADS varied enormously. Driving, signals, meteorology, munitions depots, clerical and administrative work, supporting the vast intelligence and logistics apparatus Britain ran out of Cairo and the wider Middle East theater, and the documentary record of exactly which individual women worked directly in prisoner interrogation. And what those sessions specifically involved is thin, fragmentary, and in many cases simply lost, scattered across British military archives that were not designed to record the specific contributions of locally recruited women in the first place. Historians studying the Yishuv's wartime service, including Anat Granit Hakohen in her research on Jewish women in the ATS, have argued that this is precisely the problem, that the operational significance of what these women did is underrepresented in the surviving paperwork, not because it didn't happen, but because the record-keeping habits of the time were never built to capture it. What is documented, clearly and repeatedly, is what happened next. The linguistic and intelligence training these women received inside a British military structure did not disappear when the war ended. Many of them carried it directly into the Haganah's intelligence branch, known as the Shai, and then into the newly formed intelligence services of the Israel Defense Forces after 1948. Pipeline historians have pointed to as one of the more consequential unintended outcomes of Britain's wartime recruitment policy in the Middle East, since it meant that several thousand young women entered the 1948 War of Independence already trained by the same military that had, in the very same years, restricted Jewish immigration into the territory they were defending. They served inside a contradiction they understood completely and chose anyway. None of this fits into one clean scene with one dramatic question and one German officer breaking of a woman's Frankfurt accent. That version of the story, however satisfying, isn't one the historical record actually supports for any named individual. What the record does support is stranger, and in some ways more remarkable. An entire generation of Jewish refugee women and men, on both sides of the Mediterranean, spent the war using the very identity the Nazis had tried to erase as their sharpest intelligence tool, precisely because the German officers across the table from them almost never saw it coming. If you think their names belong in the histories most people have never read, say so in the comments and subscribe, because there is a great deal more of this record still waiting to be pulled into the light.